So what is fiscal policy? It is the use of government taxing and spending powers to manage the behavior of the economy. So it's done by the Department of Finance. Its purpose is to ensure a healthy Canadian economy by developing policies of sound economic management and providing expert advice to the government. The Minister of Finance proposes an annual budget in Parliament each spring, contains estimates of government's revenue and expenditures. Stabilization policies. Stabilization policy refers to government policy designed to lessen the ups and downs of the business cycle. So, particularly inflation and unemployment. It can be either expansionary or contractionary. Expansionary policy attempts to reduce unemployment and stimulate output. Contractionary policy attempts to minimize inflation by reducing demand, which can have the side effect of reducing output. So effective stabilization policy minimizes the severity of the peaks and troughs in business cycles. So it would balance out over time anyway, but intervention policy by the government balances it out quicker, which saves a lot of job loss from a lot of, so it makes it less bad than it would be. So the government can come in to make the economy recover quicker. So that's why government intervention is needed to make the economy recover quicker than if the government wasn't there. So differences between actual output and the long run trend of potential output are therefore smaller, thus reducing recessionary and inflationary gaps. So the government comes in to bring us out of recession, and the result is that the recession ends quicker than it would have been. Stabilization policy can take the form of either fiscal policy or monetary policy. Fiscal policy uses taxes and government purchases. Expansionary fiscal policy involves more government purchases and or lower taxes to shift aggregate demand rightward. Contractionary fiscal policy involves fewer government purchases and or increased taxes to shift aggregate demand leftward. Monetary policy uses interest rates and the money supply. Rising government purchases or a cut in taxes increases aggregate demand, shifting the aggregate demand curve from 80 naught to 81. So this leads to an increase in the price level and output goes up. So if there's government spending increases, this will increase output and increase price level. So the economy will grow and prices will rise. So they do this to get the recession out. So this ends the recession in this case. Contractionary fiscal policy. So if government reduces spending, output will fall and price level will fall. And this will shrink the economy. So yeah, real GDP will fall and price will fall. So in each of the following cases, state what types of fiscal policy, if any, should be applied. So what should be done? So should expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy be used in each situation? So should expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy be used for A? So real output is less than potential level.
Do they want to increase their spending?
Yes. So it would be expansionary. So like increase government spending because you want to reach potential level. Yeah. Yeah. And then unemployment is below its natural rate. Expansionary or contractionary. Yes, this would be contractionary. Excellent. Contractionary, because usually this would mean inflation is too high. So if unemployment is lower than normal, like if people are more people are employed, like more people have jobs than should, this might mean inflation is too high in this case. So real output equals its potential level and unemployment is at its natural rate. So expansionary, contractionary, or none.
Would that be none? Because everything's like where it should be.
Yes, exactly. It would be none. Yes, because you don't need to do anything since it's yeah, everything's as where it should. Yes. So great work on that. So yeah, here's the answers here. Real output is less than potential level. Expansionary fiscal policies called for. So government increases spending and decreases taxes. Unemployment is below the natural rate. Since unemployment is below its natural rate, a contractionary fiscal policy should be used if there are signs of rising inflation. This means government purchases should be decreased and or taxes increased. Real output equals potential level, and unemployment, is at its natural rate. With the economy already at potential output and the corresponding natural rate of unemployment, there's no need for fiscal policy. Discretionary / automatic stabilizers. Discretionary fiscal policy is intentional government intervention in the economy, must be passed through the House of Commons. Automatic stabilizers are built in measures such as taxes and transfer payments, employment insurance, and welfare to lessen the effects of the business cycle. So automatic stabilizers jump in right when there's a recession. So employment insurance, if you lose your job, you have employment insurance. So it'll pay out a certain amount for you because you're out of work and you'll use this money to survive and then use it while you're looking for another job. And then it runs out like you don't have it anymore when you have another get another job. Also welfare is used for that like social assistance payments, so they increase when welfare increases when there's a recession, so it supports people that are out of work in that case. And then the discretionary fiscal policy is anything that they decide to pass when there is a recession. So any government spending bills, any tax reductions, that's done when there is a recession. So the bailouts in 2008 were part of that. So bailing out banks, bailing out auto companies, that would be part of discretionary fiscal policy. So a contracting economy decreases net tax revenues, which increases government spending and therefore business and personal incomes. An expanding economy increases net tax revenues, which decreases government spending and therefore business and personal incomes. The multiplier effect. So the multiplier effect is the magnified impact of a one-time spending change in aggregate demand. An initial spending change produces income and part of this new income because of new spending. Like we talked about the multiplier effect. The government looks at what multipliers are largest and then they invest in those things because it's going to generate the most net benefit. So each new spending round is determined by the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, which is the percentage of the increase in income that is spent on domestic consumption. Each new spending round is also determined by the marginal propensity to withdraw, MPW, which is the percentage of the increase in the income that is withdrawn from current domestic circulation, i.e. income tax, foreign imports, savings. So MPC and MPW always sum up to 100% of the increase in income. Spending multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC or 1 divided by MPW. So we did calculate this in the previous class and it shows how much return you get for every dollar of spending. So for example, if the government spends $1 on healthcare, they're going to get net benefits that are equal to $1 times the multiplier. So for every dollar spent in healthcare, the multiplier will show what the return will be. So I'm just going to income rise. So consumer spending change divided by income rise equals marginal propensity to consume.
So 80% or 0.8?
Yes, 0.8, excellent. And then the MPW is calculated as 1 minus MPC. So what would be the MPW in this case?
0.2?
Yes, 0.2, excellent. And then based on this, if we're going to use this formula or this formula here, what's the spending multiplier?
5?
Yes, 5. Yeah, excellent. 5. So yeah, 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. Excellent. So for every dollar spent in this economy, $5 of output is generated. So like basically for like every dollar invested, $5 is generated. So like you could potentially make it a multiplier for investments by predicting the by predicting the multiplier effects of that specific investment. So you would have to generate it differently than how we generate it here, but there's a lot of it's a potential option on how to figure out how much money you're going to make in an investment. So great work on that one. Yeah. And then if an economy is initially in equilibrium and injections rise by $1 million, then by how much will withdrawals have to rise to bring injections and withdrawals back into balance? So in that case, and then if the economy's MPW is 0.67, then by how much will incomes and output have to rise in order for total withdrawals to equal the initial injection of $1 million? So let's go through this here. So withdrawals in the A will have to rise by the same amount of $1 million so that injections and withdrawals are once again equal. And then if the economy's MPW is 0.67, then by how much will incomes and output have to rise in order for total withdrawals to equal the initial injection of $1 million? Income and output must rise by $1.5 million. Spending multiplier is 1.5, 1 divided by 0.67. And so at the new equilibrium where injections equal withdrawals, incomes and output must be 1.5 million higher, 1 million times 1.5. Also, since $1.5 of extra income will create $1, 0.67 times $1.50 in initial withdrawals. So impact of higher government purchases. On the left, a $1,000 rise in government purchases gradually pushes up real output by $2,000, assuming an MPC of 50%. Each round of spending adds successively smaller amounts, as indicated by the dark rectangles. Yeah. So if spending affected output alone with a spending multiplier of $1.50, $20 billion rise in government purchases would push output $30 billion from point A to point B. And this would increase prices and increase real GDP in this case. Benefits and drawbacks of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has two main benefits. It can be focused on particular regions or groups that need assistance most, has a relatively direct impact on spending. Fiscal policy has three main drawbacks. It is subject to delays, recognition lag, decision lag, impact lag. It is politically visible. It is closely related to public debt, the amount owed by the federal government. The impact of fiscal policy, a government is running a balanced budget when expenditures and revenues are equal. budget surplus when its revenues exceed expenditures, budget deficit when its expenditures exceed its revenues. When a government has a budget deficit, its debt increases by the same amount. Budget surplus, its debt decreases by the same amount. In the past, the federal government tended to run budget deficits. Because of past borrowing, the federal government pays a large public debt interest charges. Fiscal policy guidelines. There are three main approaches that can guide government fiscal policy: annually balanced budgets, cyclically balanced budgets. So cyclically balanced budgets allow deficits during recessions if accumulated debt is paid off during subsequent expansions. Functional finance budgets designed to stabilize the present economy, irrespective of the surplus or deficit it creates over the long term. Recent fiscal policy in Canada, there's been a move from functional finance towards cyclically balanced budgets. Total government deficits were highest during the early 1980s and 1990s. The 1980s deficits were largely discretionary, while the 1990s deficits were related to automatic stabilizers. Budget surplus in the late 1990s and early 2000s were due to automatic stabilizers, lower interest rates, and discretionary government spending cuts. Key automatic stabilizers are tax revenue, employment insurance, welfare. So yeah, what's happened here? So Brian Mulrooney, who just passed away, he allowed like he had uh a lot of budget deficits to invest in growing the economy. He he implemented a lot of government spending increases and reductions in taxes to invest in the future here. And that led to a lot of discretionary deficits during this period. So this was important for growing the Canadian economy long term. Even though you're taking on debt now, it was useful to invest in the future. And then here was the automatic stabilizers that led to deficits. So the automatic stabilizers kicked in because of the recession. So a recession happened during this period, and the automatic stabilizers jumped in just to protect people against job loss in the recession. So employment insurance and welfare came in to give people money to survive during the recession. And the recession was caused by higher interest rates to bring down inflation. So the government engineered a recession so they could bring down inflation, which was important because prices were way too high back then, and they needed to bring them down by raising interest rates. And then over this period here, they started to cut spending and increase taxes to save money, and the government started to save a lot of money during this period. And then back into recession. So as you can see here, this was growth. So investment in growth from 1980 to 1989. So investment in growth through borrowing. So that was useful there. And then automatic stabilizers, recession in early 1990s. And employment insurance and welfare kicked in to support the economy. And this led to borrowing. And then here, the economy was growing, and the government could save money because they had growth and taxes were coming in. More taxes were coming in due to the growing economy. So that was happening here. And then they go back into recession. So back into recession in 2008, and employment, insurance, and welfare kick in. So employment insurance and welfare are used to stabilize the economy during recessions. So the combined budget balances for the federal, provincial, and territorial governments are shown as percentage of Canada's nominal GDP. Recessions in the early 1980s and early 1990s each caused increase in combined budget deficits. During the long economic expansion of the 1990s, these deficits gradually declined and turned into combined surplus, only to return to a deficit in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 recession. Yeah. So yeah, we go from deficits until about 1996 to surpluses from the late 1990s to mid 2000s and then financial crises. Yeah. So we've been in deficits ever since, basically. And now it's actually over $1 trillion now because of the COVID-19 crisis. The Canadian government spent hundreds of billions of dollars in getting us out of the COVID-19 crisis. So our debt is over $1 trillion now. So if we compare our Canadian gross debt to GDP versus the US, if we can compare both of them, the US has a higher amount of debt to GDP than Canada based on this ratio, but they can take that on because they have a strong currency. So the US dollar is a lot stronger than the Canadian dollar, and that's why they're able to take this on because they're able to print money to finance this debt. But Canada can't do that as much because we don't have a strong enough currency. The only like you can print a lot of money from your central bank if you have a strong currency. So the US is a very strong currency. It's the strongest in the world. And that's why they're able to print trillions and trillions of dollars because the currency will remain strong. You can't print money if the currency's weak because the currency will be worth nothing. But with the US, their currency's the strongest in the world and will remain strong, likely. So they can just keep printing money and the money will be worth something. But once it starts becoming weak, then they can't print anymore. But that's what they've been using to keep their debt above this here. Canada would never be able to have a debt as high as the US because the Canadian dollar is nowhere near as strong as the US. Even though we're one of the strongest currencies in the world, it's still not to the scale of the US, unfortunately. But the US, if they damage their credit rating, if they didn't pay back their debts, and their economy was in shambles, then their currency value would go down a lot. So as long as their currency is strong, they're able to borrow as much as they can because they can print it and finance that way. So as you can see here, the Canadian US government net debt to GDP, the US is over 80%. Canada is just under 30%, but it's Canada has crept up more. But like I said, the US is able to do this because they have a much stronger currency. And that's the only reason why they're able to do this. If they didn't have a strong currency, they wouldn't be able to do this. Yeah, they would have to have a lot less debt because they wouldn't be able to print money to finance this debt. So debate over public debt. Those who support using public debt say public debt provides benefits by reducing the cost of unemployment. About 80% of federal debt is held by Canadians or owed to ourselves. When debt is used to create productive assets is not necessarily a problem. There have been times in the past where public debt as a percent of GDP was higher than now. Those against using public debt say public debt charges rose until recently. Provincial and territorial debts need to be taken into account as well. There are limits to how much taxes can be raised to pay public debt charges. There are potential future burdens associated with crowding out the fact and the amount of Canada's government debt held by foreigners. Printing money to pay off debt could cause inflation. So, active learning, a government has an outstanding debt of $100 billion. If in a given year, the government spends $10 billion and brings in $15 billion in taxes, then what is the government's budget deficit or surplus and what happens to its debt?
It's a surplus?
Yes, surplus. Excellent. Yes, so yeah, surplus of 5 billion. Yeah, and debt, excellent. So debt is 5 billion less than before. So it'll be 195 billion total now. Sorry, 95 billion total now. Excellent. So if instead the government's expenditures are 12.5 billion and its tax revenues are 10 billion, then what is the government's budget deficit or surplus and what happens to its debt?
Deficit of 2.5 billion?
Yes. Excellent. And then what happens to its debt?
Is its debt still, hold on. Wait, is it debt, it's expenditures?
So debt is deficit is per
Oh,
year.
I didn't see the part at the top, sorry.
Oh, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay.
So you just add 2.5 billion to that then, right?
Yes, exactly. So the deficit is per year debt, and then debt is the whole debt is all the deficits added up. So deficit is per year, and debt is all deficits added up. Yeah. So good job on that, both of you. That was great. And I'll just paste this in chat here. So it's similar to a budget in a household. So you want to make sure that you spend within your means. But with the government, they can borrow a lot more than we can. So the government constantly is in deficit. So the US government will never get a deficit, unlikely, and the Canadian government might not either. So they can borrow more than we do, but in our case, like in an individual case or household case, we can't borrow as much as the government. We have to spend within our means for the most part. So we have to our expenditures must be lower than our income because we can't borrow as much as the government does. So yeah, with expenditures of 10 billion and tax revenues of 15 billion, there's a budget surplus of 5 billion, and the government's debt falls to 95 billion. If expenditures are 12.5 billion and tax revenues are 10 billion, there's a budget deficit of 2.5 billion. And now the debt is 102.5 billion. A federal government budget surplus is associated with what? So be D. So tax revenue is larger than government spending and is used to combat inflation. Yeah. So yeah, surplus taxes have to be greater than government spending. Yeah. So here, as you can see by this graph, the unemployment rate is dropping and inflation is rising. So what is the main economic problem shown by these statistics in 2019?
Inflation's rising?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's becoming more unaffordable. Yeah, this is similar to what we're dealing with lately in Canada, that inflation has been rising a lot in the last few years, and yeah, this is a similar problem. So good point. Good job. And then describe the appropriate fiscal policy for the Department of Finance, decrease government spending and or taxes, slow down the economy, and prevent inflation from spiraling out of control. So they can do that that's fiscal policy, like a fiscal policy way they can do to solve this problem. But what the Canadian government did for our inflation problem recently was they raised interest rates. So they can do that too. They like to do that instead because decreasing government spending and increasing taxes is very unpopular because people don't like cuts and they don't like higher taxes. They don't like government cuts and they don't like higher taxes. So it's more popular to raise interest rates because because they can keep the programs that they have. They don't have to lose government programs and they don't have to pay more taxes and the problem gets solved. But there's other costs. You can borrow less. Things cost more, like loans cost more. It's more expensive to pay mortgage payments and more expensive to pay loan payments. So there is a cost to it, but it seems like the most popular option based on the government's rationale there. So, briefly explain how a budget deficit arises and how it can be funded. So, yeah. So, how does a budget deficit happen and how can you fund it? How can you pay for it?
So if their spending is more than their taxes,
Yes, exactly. And how can you pay for a budget deficit?
I don't remember.
Oh, it's okay. So there's a lot of things you can do to pay for the budget deficit. You can, so budget deficits can be paid for through borrowing from citizens and from other countries. So, so selling bonds is a version of borrowing. So, selling bonds to Canadians and other countries will allow for borrowing. Also, printing money at the central bank is used for funding budget deficits. So, so a lot of the stimulus needed for COVID-19 recovery was from printed money at the central bank. So, this caused a lot of inflation through an increase in the money supply. So that's how they fund budget deficits. Those are the two ways that they do that. Also, there's another way that they do. So there's one more I'll just state here. So the other way is through going into savings. So spending money from savings. So that's what the government does too. So those are the three ways that the government pays off a budget deficit. And it's similar to households too, except we can't print money. That's the one thing we can't do. So it's very similar. The borrowing is similar to us, and the savings is similar to us. So we can borrow and we can dip into our savings to pay off our deficits, but we can't print money. So that's the difference between us and the government. We can't print money, but they can. Yeah. But they can only print money to a certain amount because there's just too much inflation that will happen with printing too much money. So yeah, budget deficit rises from spending exceeds tax revenue. So so is that so what do you mean by that, Chris Bell? Is it are you joking or yeah, yeah, true. Yeah, get a printing press. Yeah, yeah, the so yeah, the some So the US did give printing presses to other countries at one point. So they gave a printing press to Iraq at one point. So they could print money, but yeah, not many of us can. Yeah. So borrowing capital markets, just like corporations, borrow from the central bank. Most countries did this in 2009, print money. So yeah, that those are the things that you can do. Yeah. So same result, government borrows for free and money supply increases. So contrast government debt with deficit or surplus.
Sorry, what are you asking? Are you asking if government debt's the same as one of those two? Or I mean, the opposite of one of those two?
Yeah, so is it like what's the difference between government debt and budget deficit or surplus?
Want to be the same as a deficit?
Yeah, it basically is. So the debt is just adding up all the deficits. Yeah. Yes, exactly, Christabel. So government debt is ongoing, where budget deficit is or surplus is yearly. Yes. So that's really the difference. Deficit is all debts. So debt is deficits added together. Deficit and surplus is yearly, while debt is all together. So great points. So government debt equals total amount the government has borrowed over time. Budget deficit or surplus is how much has been borrowed or paid back in one particular year. So what are some practical difficulties of discretionary fiscal policy? So that's the government bailouts that happen during a recession. So what are some difficulties of government bailouts?
Is one of the bailouts printing money and then you can get inflation if that happens, if you print too much?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That would be one of the issues, yeah, for sure. So that's what happened with COVID-19, the recovery was that like you said, printing too much money that led to a lot of inflation. Are there any other issues with government spending during recessions? Lowering taxes too much and trying to make it up later. Yes, Christabel, yes. So yeah, the too much debt, like they don't bring in enough money, so they have to borrow more. So that and then making up later might be hard. Yeah, great points. Expansionary fiscal policy can crowd out business and consumer borrows and raise interest rates, which tends to reduce the expansionary impact of policy. So if you spend too much if the government spends too much, that can raise interest rates, which is not a good thing. Yeah. And then yeah, and then exactly. So you'll have to cut spending later, like Christabel said, because the interest rates are too high. Yeah. There are long and variable time lags in enacting fiscal policy and waiting for it to have an effect. The impact of temporary fiscal policy is smaller than the impact of permanent fiscal policy. It may be hard to persuade